The Missouri countryside stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, its rolling hills dotted with skeletal trees that clawed at the approaching winter clouds. Snow had begun to fall in earnest by the time the last carriage wound its way up the serpentine path to Hargrove Manor, its wheels crunching over frozen earth and scattered leaves. Margaret Hargrove Whitmore pulled her fur-lined cloak tighter as she stepped from her carriage, her breath forming ghostly plumes in the bitter air. The manor loomed before her like a Gothic monument to her family's prosperity, 3 stories of dark stone and wrought iron, with windows that seemed to watch rather than welcome. She had not set foot on this property in 7 years, not since the bitter argument that had severed her ties with her father. "Still as cheerful as a mausoleum," she muttered, adjusting her black morning dress. Her younger brother Thomas emerged from a second carriage, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the long journey from St. Louis. His gambling debts had grown legendary in the city's social circles, and Margaret could see the desperation lurking behind his forced smile. "Sister," he nodded curtly, his eyes already calculating, "I trust your journey wasn't too arduous." "No more than yours, I imagine." Margaret's voice carried the chill of the winter air. "Though I suspect we're both here for the same reason." The third carriage brought their cousin Edmund, Elias's nephew, whose own branch of the family had fallen on hard times after a series of failed investments. His wife Clara clung to his arm, her pale face reflecting the anxiety they all felt. Their twin daughters, barely 16, huddled close together like frightened sparrows. The massive oak doors of the manor creaked open, revealing Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper who had served the Hargrove family for over 3 decades. Her weathered face bore the weight of recent grief, but her spine remained rigid with duty. "The family is expected in the library at precisely 4 o'clock, she announced, without preamble. Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, the family attorney, arrived this morning along with the other gentleman." "Other gentleman?" Thomas inquired, removing his snow-dusted hat. Mrs. Holloway's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "A foreign man. He speaks little English, but Mr. Blackwood assures us he is essential to the proceedings." The family exchanged glances as they were led through the manor's familiar, yet somehow changed corridors. The portraits of long-dead Hargroves seemed to follow their movement, and the very air felt thick with unspoken secrets. Margaret noticed that several rooms had been sealed with heavy curtains, and a strange, medicinal smell permeated the atmosphere. In the library, a fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with leather-bound volumes. Mr. Blackwood, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stood beside the mahogany desk where Elias had conducted his business for 40 years, but it was the figure seated in the corner that drew their attention. The stranger was a man of indeterminate age, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent and dark hair slicked back from a high forehead. His clothes were well made, but foreign in cut, and his hands, long-fingered and surprisingly delicate, rested motionless on his knees. Most unsettling were his eyes, dark, unblinking, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This is Mr. Dmitri Volkov," Blackwood announced, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "He has traveled from the Carpathian region at your father's specific request, made several years ago." "For what purpose?" Edmund demanded, his arm tightening protectively around his wife. Blackwood cleared his throat and opened a leather portfolio. "That will become clear as we proceed with the reading of the will. Please be seated." As the family arranged themselves in the heavy chairs before the desk, the wind outside intensified, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling against the glass. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving in earnest. "Before we begin," Blackwood continued, "I must inform you that your father's final wishes are unconventional. He was quite specific that no one was to leave the manor until all terms have been fulfilled." The storm, it seems, will ensure compliance with that particular stipulation. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Blackwood?" The attorney's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the document. "I am saying, Miss Hargrove Whitmore, that your father's will is unlike any I have encountered in 30 years of practice. And I fear that by the time we are finished here, none of us will be quite the same." In his corner, Dmitri Volkov smiled for the first time since their arrival. It was not a pleasant expression. Outside, the storm intensified, and the first true blizzard of winter began to bury Hargrove Manor beneath a blanket of white that would not lift for days to come. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 times, its deep resonance seeming to echo through the very bones of the manor. "Mr." Blackwood adjusted his spectacles and began to read, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I, Elias Hargrove, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my final will and testament on this 15th day of October, in the year of our Lord 1873. The family leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and snow continued to pile against the windows. "To my beloved family, who have shared in my prosperity and my secrets, I leave not merely material wealth, but the truth of our legacy. For too long, the Hargrove name has been built upon foundations of blood and shadow. It is time for that truth to be written where it cannot be hidden or denied." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Father always did have a flair for the dramatic. Blackwood continued reading, his voice growing more strained with each word. "Each heir shall receive their inheritance, but only after they have accepted the terms to be inscribed upon their flesh, by the hand of Dmitri Volkov, master craftsman of the ancient art. What is written cannot be undone, and what is revealed cannot be forgotten." "Inscribed upon our flesh," Clara whispered, her face growing even paler. "What does that mean?" Dmitri Volkov rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to a large leather case that had been placed beside the fireplace. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he opened the case to reveal an array of instruments that gleamed in the firelight. Needles, small hammers, vials of dark ink, and other tools whose purposes were unclear but undeniably sinister. "Your father," Volkov spoke for the first time, his accent thick and his voice carrying an odd musical quality. "He understands that words on paper, they can be burned, lost, forgotten, but words in skin, they are forever." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This is madness. I won't be party to some barbaric ritual." "Sit down, Margaret." The voice came from the doorway, and the family turned to see Mrs. Holloway standing there, but her expression had changed completely. Gone was the dutiful servant. In her place stood a woman whose eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed ancient and terrible. "Mrs. Holloway?" Edmund's voice cracked slightly. "I have served this family for 33 years, she said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her with a decisive click. "I have kept its secrets, cleaned its messes, and buried its sins, but tonight the truth will finally surface." Blackwood's hands shook as he continued reading. "To my daughter Margaret, I leave the Eastern properties and their associated enterprises. But she must first accept the mark that reveals her true parentage and the price of her mother's death." Margaret's face went white. "My mother died in childbirth. Everyone knows that." Mrs. Holloway's laugh was bitter. "Your mother died because she discovered what your father really was, what this family really is." "To my son Thomas," Blackwood read on, "I leave the Western holdings and the silver mines. But he must bear the mark that shows the true source of his gambling debts and to whom he is truly indebted." Thomas shot to his feet. "That's impossible. My debts are my own business." Volkov had begun arranging his instruments on a small table, each tool placed with ceremonial precision. "In my country," he said without looking up, "we have saying, The sins of the father are written in the blood of the children. Your father, he understand this very well. To my nephew Edmund and his family, Blackwood continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, I leave the northern lands and the family business interests. But he must accept the mark that reveals what happened to his own father, my brother, and why his family's fortune truly disappeared. Edmund's face crumpled. Uncle Elias told us father died of fever. Your father died because he threatened to expose us, Mrs. Holloway said matter-of-factly. Just as your mother will die if you refuse to comply tonight. Clara gasped and pulled her daughters closer. You're threatening us. I am explaining the situation, Mrs. Holloway replied. The storm outside is no accident. The roads are impassable, and they will remain so until this business is concluded. Your father arranged for every contingency. Volkov had finished his preparations and now stood beside his instruments, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. The process, it is not pleasant, he said conversationally, but it is necessary. The ink I use, it is special, made from, how you say, organic materials. It will show not just words, but visions, memories, truth. Margaret backed toward the window, but the glass was already thick with ice. This is insane. We can break the windows, escape somehow, into a blizzard, in the middle of nowhere, with no horses. Thomas's voice held a note of hysteria. We'd freeze to death within an hour. Blackwood set down the will with trembling hands. There is more, much more, but Mr. Volkov insists that the markings must begin before the full truth can be revealed. He says the ink needs time to settle. Who will be first? Volkov asked, his smile returning. In the firelight his teeth seemed unnaturally sharp. The family looked at each other, fear and greed warring in their expressions. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, a door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The true horror of Elias Hargrove's final testament was only beginning to unfold. The silence stretched like a taut wire until Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set with desperate determination. I'll go first, he announced, his voice steadier than his hands. If this is what it takes to claim what's rightfully mine, then so be it. Margaret stared at her brother in disbelief. Thomas, you can't seriously be considering this madness. Can't I? Thomas's laugh held no humor. You don't understand, Margaret. You've been living comfortably on your husband's wealth. I have debts that will see me in prison or worse, if they're not settled soon. Volkov gestured to a heavy wooden chair that Mrs. Holloway had positioned near his instruments. The chair bore dark stains that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. Please sit. Remove your shirt. As Thomas reluctantly complied, his pale chest revealed the soft physique of a man who had lived too well and worked too little. Volkov examined him with the clinical detachment of a physician, his cold fingers tracing along Thomas's collarbone. Here, Volkov murmured, tapping a spot just above Thomas's heart. The truth of debt must be written where it can feel the blood's rhythm. What exactly are you going to write? Thomas asked, his bravado beginning to crack. Volkov selected a needle from his array of instruments, its point gleaming wickedly in the firelight. Your father, he was very specific. Each mark tells a story. Your story begins with the night you first gambled away money that was not yours. Thomas's face went ashen. How could you possibly know about that? I know many things, Volkov replied, dipping the needle into a vial of ink that seemed to move with a life of its own. Your father, he kept very detailed records. The first puncture of the needle drew a sharp gasp from Thomas. But it was not just the pain that made him cry out. It was the sudden flood of memory that crashed over him like a tide. The gambling den in St. Louis, the desperate night when he had stolen from his employer's safe, the moment he realized he was trapped in a web of debt that stretched far beyond anything he had imagined. Stop, he whispered. But Volkov's hand continued its methodical work. As the needle moved across his skin, forming letters and symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. Thomas began to speak in a voice not entirely his own. The money. It wasn't just from the office safe. I took it from the church fund, from the orphanage donations. Children went hungry because of what I stole. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth in horror. Thomas, no! But Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as more ink entered his skin. And the debts, they're not to gambling houses. They're to men who traffic in human misery, slavers who still operate despite the war's end. I've been helping them move their cargo through Missouri in exchange for forgiveness of what I owe. Edmund stood abruptly, his face twisted with disgust. You've been helping slavers after everything this country has been through. I had no choice, Thomas screamed, but even as he said it, the ink revealed the lie. The needle had traced out names, dates, locations, a complete record of his complicity in horrors that made his gambling debts seem trivial. Volkov paused in his work, studying the partially completed design. Interesting. The ink, it shows more than your father anticipated. It seems your sins run deeper than even he knew. Mrs. Holloway moved closer, her eyes fixed on the dark marks spreading across Thomas's chest. The ink responds to guilt, she explained to the horrified family. The deeper the shame, the more it reveals. How is this possible? Clara whispered, clutching her daughters so tightly they whimpered. There are old ways, Mrs. Holloway replied, ways that predate your Christian churches and your modern sensibilities. Your father learned them during his travels in Eastern Europe, before he built this empire of respectability. Volkov resumed his work, and with each new mark, Thomas's confessions grew more damning. He spoke of bribes paid to judges, of witnesses who had disappeared, of a network of corruption that stretched from the Missouri countryside to the halls of power in Washington itself. The Hargrove fortune! Thomas gasped as the needle traced a final, elaborate symbol. It's not built on farming and honest trade. It's built on blood and suffering. Father was never a legitimate businessman. He was a criminal who learned to hide behind respectability. The completed tattoo was a masterwork of dark artistry. At first glance, it appeared to be an ornate family crest, but as the firelight played across the fresh ink, other images emerged. Faces of the dead, maps of underground railroads running in reverse, ledgers recording transactions in human flesh. Thomas slumped in the chair, his face grey with exhaustion and shame. I can see them, he whispered. All the people who suffered because of what I did. They're in the ink watching me. Volkov cleaned his instruments with methodical precision. The first mark is complete, but this is only the beginning. Each of you carries secrets that must be revealed before the inheritance can be claimed. Margaret backed further toward the window, but the glass was now completely obscured by ice and snow. I won't do this. I won't submit to this barbarism. You will, Mrs. Holloway said with quiet certainty, because the alternative is far worse than anything Mr. Volkov's needle can inflict. As if summoned by her words, a new sound echoed through the manor. The slow, deliberate footsteps of someone moving through the corridors above. But that was impossible. Everyone was accounted for in the library. Who else is in this house? Edmund demanded. Mrs. Holloway's smile was cold as winter. Your father may be dead, but his will extends beyond the grave. The manor itself has become part of his testament, and it will not release you until every secret has been carved into flesh and every debt has been paid in full. The footsteps above grew louder, more insistent, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the library door, something that might once have been Elias Hargrove began to descend the stairs. The footsteps on the stairs grew closer, each creak of the old wood sending shivers through the assembled family. Thomas remained slumped in the chair, his fresh tattoo glistening with blood and that strange living ink. The symbols seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, and occasionally faces would appear in the dark lines. Victims whose suffering had funded the Hargrove legacy. That's impossible, Edmund whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Uncle Elias is dead. I saw his body myself. Mrs. Holloway's expression remained impassive. Death is not always the end, particularly for those who have made certain arrangements. The library door swung open with a prolonged groan, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the hearth flickered but did not die, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance independently of the flames. In the doorway stood a figure that bore the shape of Elias Hargrove, but was somehow fundamentally wrong. The thing that had been the family patriarch was tall and gaunt, its skin bearing a waxy pallor that spoke of the grave. Its eyes, once a warm brown, now glowed with an inner light that was neither warm nor entirely human. When it spoke, its voice carried the hollow echo of wind through empty chambers. "My children," it said, and the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have begun to receive your inheritance, but there is so much more to learn." Margaret pressed herself against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Reality," the Elias thing replied, "is far more flexible than you have been taught to believe. I learned this truth during my travels in the Carpathian Mountains, where I met Mr. Volkov and others of his profession." Volkov bowed slightly to the apparition, his movements respectful, but not surprised. "Master Hargrove, the first marking is complete. Shall we proceed with the next?" "Indeed." The dead man's gaze fell upon Margaret, and she felt as though ice water had been poured into her veins. "My daughter, so proud, so certain of her moral superiority. Come, let us reveal the truth of your birth and your mother's death." "I won't," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. The cold radiating from her father's corpse seemed to be seeping into her bones, making movement increasingly difficult. "You will," Elias replied, "because the alternative is to remain here forever, trapped between life and death as I am, watching your family's sins play out in endless repetition." Mrs. Holloway moved to Margaret's side, her touch surprisingly gentle. "It's better to know the truth, child. The not knowing is what drives people mad." Reluctantly, Margaret allowed herself to be led to the chair. Thomas had been moved to a corner, where he sat staring at his tattoo, occasionally whimpering as new visions appeared in the ink. The sight of her brother's broken state filled Margaret with a terror that went beyond the supernatural. "Remove your dress," Volkov instructed, his tone clinical. "The mark must be placed over your heart, where the truth of your mother's love can be properly inscribed." With trembling hands, Margaret loosened her bodice, exposing her pale shoulder and the upper portion of her chest. Volkov examined her skin with the same detached professionalism he had shown Thomas, finally selecting a spot just below her collarbone. "Your mother," the dead Elias said, moving closer until Margaret could smell the grave earth on his clothes, "was not the innocent victim you have always believed her to be." The first touch of the needle brought not just pain, but a flood of images that were not her own memories. She saw her mother, young and beautiful, but not the gentle saint of family legend. This woman was calculating, ambitious, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of wealth and status. "She married me not for love," Elias continued, "but because she had discovered the true source of the Hargrove fortune. She intended to blackmail me, to take control of the family business for herself." And as Volkov worked, the ink revealing its terrible truths, Margaret found herself speaking words that came from some deep, buried knowledge. She killed people. Mother killed people who got in her way, the servants who disappeared, the business partners who had accidents. She was behind it all. "And you," Elias said with something that might have been paternal pride, "are her daughter in every way that matters. Tell them about your husband, Margaret. Tell them how he really died." Margaret tried to resist, but the ink was in her bloodstream now, carrying its revelations through her entire being. "He found out about the money I was taking from his accounts, the money I was sending back here to help Father expand the business. When he threatened to expose me, you poisoned him." Edmund finished, his voice hollow with horror. Slowly, Margaret confirmed, tears streaming down her face. Over months, made it look like a wasting disease. I inherited everything, just as Mother would have wanted. The tattoo taking shape on her chest was even more elaborate than Thomas's. It showed a family tree, but one whose roots were watered with blood, and whose branches bore fruit that was rotten at the core. Each leaf contained a face, victims of the Hargrove family's rise to power. The women of this family, Volkov observed as he worked, they are perhaps more dangerous than the men. They understand that true power comes not from force, but from patience and careful planning. As the needle completed its work, Margaret's tattoo began to move more actively than Thomas's had. The faces in the ink turned to look at her, their mouths opening in silent screams of accusation. She could feel their pain, their terror, their final moments of realization that they had been betrayed by someone they trusted. "Now you understand," Elias said, his dead eyes reflecting the firelight. "The Hargrove legacy is not one of honest prosperity, but of calculated evil spanning generations. And you, my dear children, are its inheritors in every sense of the word." Edmund clutched his wife and daughters closer, his face pale with the growing realization of what was to come. "What about us? What secrets do we carry?" The dead man's smile was terrible to behold. "Oh, my dear nephew, your story is perhaps the most tragic of all. For you have spent your entire life believing yourself to be the innocent victim of circumstances, when in truth, you are the architect of your own family's destruction." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but now it seemed less like natural weather and more like the physical manifestation of the Hargrove family's accumulated guilt and shame. The manor itself groaned under the weight of its secrets, and somewhere in its depths, other voices began to whisper, the voices of all those who had died to build the family's fortune. The night was far from over, and the worst revelations were yet to come. Edmund's hands shook as he stared at his uncle's corpse, the weight of impending revelation crushing down upon him like the snow that continued to pile against the manor's windows. His wife Clara had gone deathly pale while their twin daughters huddled together, sensing the adult terror that filled the room, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its source. "Please," Edmund whispered, his voice breaking. "My girls, they're innocent. Whatever sins I may carry, they don't deserve to witness this." The dead Elias tilted his head, considering. "Innocence," he mused, "is a luxury that the Hargrove bloodline has never been able to afford. But perhaps arrangements can be made." Mrs. Holloway moved toward the twins with surprising gentleness. "Come, children, there's a warm room upstairs where you can wait while the adults finish their business." "No!" Clara cried, clutching her daughters tighter. "I won't let them out of my sight, not in this house of horrors. They will be safe," Volkov said, cleaning his needles with methodical precision. "What comes next is not for young eyes to see. The truth of your husband's sins will be particularly disturbing." As Mrs. Holloway led the reluctant twins from the room, their mother's sobs echoing behind them, Edmund slowly approached the chair where his cousins had received their terrible inheritances. Thomas sat catatonic in the corner, his tattoo now showing a constantly shifting tableau of his victim's suffering. Margaret had collapsed into another chair, her own markings pulsing with the rhythm of her guilty heart. "Tell me," Edmund said, his voice hollow with resignation. "Tell me what I've done." Elias's corpse moved closer, its movements unnaturally fluid. "You truly don't remember, do you? The mind has remarkable ways of protecting itself from unbearable truths." Edmund removed his shirt with trembling hands, revealing a chest marked by old scars, thin, precise lines that spoke of deliberate cutting. "I've had these since I was a child," he said. "Mother always told me they were from an accident." "Not an accident," Volkov murmured, examining the old scars with professional interest. "These are ritual marks. Someone tried to bind your memories, to lock away what you had done. But my ink will break any binding. The first touch of the needle brought a scream that seemed to tear from Edmund's very soul. But it was not just pain. It was the sudden, overwhelming return of memories that had been buried for over 20 years. "I was 7 years old," Edmund gasped as the ink began its work. "Father had discovered something about Uncle Elias's business. He was going to expose everything, destroy the family to save his conscience. And you," Elias said with something that might have been pride, "were such a clever child, so eager to please, so willing to help." The tattoo forming on Edmund's chest was different from the others. Instead of symbols or faces, it showed a series of scenes playing out like a macabre theatre. A young boy creeping through darkened hallways, a man sleeping peacefully in his bed, and then, "I put the poison in his water glass," Edmund whispered, his voice that of a child confessing to breaking a toy. "Uncle Elias told me it was medicine, that Father was sick and needed help sleeping. I believed him. I wanted to help." Clara's scream of horror echoed through the library. No, that's not possible. You were just a child." "Children," Volkov observed as he continued his work, "they make the perfect instruments of murder. Who would suspect them? Who would believe them capable of such acts?" The ink revealed more as it spread across Edmund's skin. The boy who had poisoned his father had been carefully groomed by Elias, trained to be the perfect weapon. When Edmund's mother had grown suspicious, she too had met with an accident, arranged by her own son, though he had been made to forget it immediately afterward. "The family fortune that you thought you lost through bad investments," Elias explained, "was never lost at all. It was transferred to me, payment for my silence about your crimes. You have been living on my charity your entire adult life, believing yourself to be a victim when you are, in fact, one of my most successful creations." Edmund's tattoo was now complete, and it was the most horrifying of all. It showed not just his childhood murders, but the continuing influence of his uncle's corruption. Every business decision, every family choice, every moment of his adult life had been subtly guided by Elias's will. Even his marriage to Clara had been arranged, his daughters bred for purposes that were only now becoming clear. "The twins," Edmund gasped, understanding flooding through him. "You want the twins." "And the next generation," Elias confirmed. "Young minds, unformed consciences, perfect vessels for the continuation of our work. They will be raised to understand that morality is a luxury for the weak, that power is the only truth that matters." Clara lunged toward the door, but Mrs. Holloway blocked her path. "Your daughters are safe for now," the housekeeper said, "but their safety depends on your cooperation." "What more do you want from us?" Margaret demanded, her voice raw from screaming. "You've revealed our sins, carved them into our flesh. What else is there?" Volkov had begun packing his instruments, but he left one item on the table, a vial of ink that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of darkness. "The final inheritance," he said simply. Elias's corpse moved to the center of the room, and as it did, the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. "You have each received your individual legacies, the truth of your sins, carved where they can never be hidden. But there is one final gift that you must share. The family business," Mrs. Holloway explained, "requires continuity. Your father's death was not the end, but a transformation. He has become something beyond human limitations, able to guide and protect the Hargrove interests for generations to come." "You want us to become like him," Thomas said, his voice barely human after hours of witnessing his tattoo's revelations. "You want us to die and return as things." "Not death," Volkov corrected. "Evolution. The ink I have used contains more than pigment and memory. It contains the essence of those who have gone before, the accumulated will of the Hargrove bloodline. It will change you, make you stronger, more capable of carrying on the family traditions. The tattoos on all three family members began to glow with an inner light, and they could feel something moving through their veins, something that was not quite blood and not quite alive, but possessed of a terrible intelligence. "The storm will end at dawn," Elias announced. "When it does, you will leave this place and return to your lives, but you will no longer be entirely human. You will be the guardians of our legacy, ensuring that the Hargrove name continues to prosper through whatever means necessary." "And if we refuse?" Edmund asked, though they all knew the answer. "Then you remain here," Mrs. Holloway said simply. "Forever. Trapped between life and death, watching your daughters grow up to take your place." As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the snow-covered windows, the three family members felt the final transformation beginning. Their tattoos had become more than mere ink. They were now living things, connected to every victim, every crime, every drop of blood that had built the Hargrove fortune. They would leave the manor as they had arrived, but they would never again be free of its influence. The inheritance they had received was not wealth or property, but a curse that would bind them to their family's dark legacy for all eternity. Outside, the storm finally began to subside, but the true horror was just beginning. For the Hargrove family had learned that some inheritances cannot be refused, and some debts can only be paid in blood and suffering that spans generations. The manor stood silent in the growing light, waiting for the next gathering, the next revelation, the next chapter in a story that would never truly end.